Welcome back, everyone, to more NASCAR Heat 2 coverage here on Knee Pit Gaming. So today's video is going to be all about Iowa Speedway. Iowa is a great track, a short track, about 3/4 of a mile in length. It is really fast and can be quite a bit of fun to drive. We're going to be taking a look at setups for trucks and Xfinity car, and then we're going to end the video, as always, with some gameplay footage of a short race with me against the maximum difficulty AI. So let's go ahead and head to the track. Before we get into talking about the setup itself, let's start off by talking a little bit about the track. As I mentioned, it's about 3/4 mile track, and it's a D-shaped oval, which means that the entry to turn 1 and entry of turn 3 are going to be very different. The biggest advice I can give you on this track is lift going into the corner sooner than you think you need to. And I know that's hard to do because this track has tons of grip and you can be extremely aggressive with the gas pedal if you decide to. But that's not necessarily the quickest way around. Driving it into the corner as deep as you possibly can doesn't necessarily always equate to more speed. Also, whenever you're going through the corner, this track in real life particularly is notorious for having multiple grooves. So there are easily 2, 3, 4 grooves you can run around this place from the very bottom all the way up to the very top by the wall. This setup handles great for me in all of those grooves, with the difference being that it is indeed faster the lower you get on the track. So keep that in mind. If you move up the track some, depending on how far up the track you move, you might lose a tenth, maybe 2/10. So it's not terribly bad, but just keep that in mind on the track. Your quickest lap times that I have found are when you get as close to that yellow line in the corners as possible. Now, you have to be careful when you get down there in the corners because there is a part where the banking falls away. It's almost like they didn't take that into account and when they were designing the track for the purposes of the game. Again, we're not talking real life, we're talking the game here. Because the banking actually goes flat or flatter right before you get to the yellow line. So you don't want to get quite to the yellow line because it can really disrupt the car, particularly if you're on the throttle. Also, another thing to keep in mind in the corners is because they've tried to do the increased banking or graduated banking in the corners about halfway up the track, you're going to notice that the banking increases. And that's a good thing normally, as it allows you to carry a little bit more speed. But keep that in mind if you're going to be crossing over that portion of the banking where it adjusts, because they can get your car really loose, again, particularly if you're on the throttle. So with those couple of things in mind, with the trucks, I run quicker laps are about in the 23.6 range, and normal laps for me are somewhere around 23.7. Again, most of that deals with how good I am at entry. If I lift early enough on entry, then I can get the truck all the way to the bottom, or the car as the case may be. And if I can get it all the way to the bottom, then I can be very aggressive with the throttle coming off the corner, and it really allows the car or truck to flow through the corner without getting bound up and without getting really tight, which scrubs off a lot of speed. So keep that in mind. When in doubt, lift off earlier than you think you need to, because that'll allow you to get to the bottom and be very aggressive with the throttle. Now, the way I run this track is when I lift off the gas, I do not use the brake going into the corner. Obviously, if you want to try using the brake into the corner, then you can drive it in deeper, and you'll need to adjust the brake bias for that in all likelihood. But just keep in mind, I made this setup based on the fact of I don't use the brakes getting into the corner or even in the middle of the corner. Now, that all changes when you get on the track against the AI. I can tell you that the AI on this track are as competitive as I've had them yet on any track, really. They can run some really good lap times. The gameplay footage you're going to see at the end of this video is a pretty good race that I had with them. Now, you're going to get the normal craziness that you get from the AI. I started in the back and was able to move my way all the way through the field. But once I got to the top 3, top 5 trucks, it really began to be a lot more fun than I was expecting after the total madness and craziness that you get in the back and middle of the pack. So again, keep that in mind. If you're going to run against the AI, the bottom is your best bet, because in general, they will give you the bottom groove through the corners, and you can use that to your advantage. Now, what that means is that the AI will generally try to pinch you down on the straightaways. They don't run a good line on this track at all, even though their speeds come out good. So be prepared against the AI to have to run about halfway down on the straightaway and then try to use the bottom in the corners. If you can do that and keep the car rotating, which you should be able to do with this setup or some variation of it, then you should be fine against them. But just keep that in mind. You're not going to be able to run the wide arcing entries into the corner and exit as you might be used to. Now let's go ahead and talk about the setup itself. And I will start off by telling you that I used the same setup for the trucks and the Xfinity cars on this track. I didn't make any changes. Now, I'm not saying there's not room for changes. The Xfinity cars handle a little bit different than the trucks here because of the horsepower differences. But I found that there were really no changes necessary, so I left it as is for the purposes of simplicity for you guys and not having to worry about two different setups for one track. In the case of the shocks, we'll start there, and I really didn't do much there. I start off with 10s across the board, basically at every track, unless it's extremely bumpy. And this one, I didn't really feel the need to change it off the 10s, but again, feel free to adjust those to your liking. Left weight is always maxed out because we're on an oval, no reason to move it around. Front weight, I moved back about basically as far as I could until the car started to get really loose on entry. So be careful of entry, and an easy fix if you're getting loose on entry, especially whenever you're really steering the car into the corner hard. You got a lot of steering input into it. If you're getting loose on entry, a quick fix to that to at least help it out is to move some of the weight forward. So we're at 49.5%. That really helps the car to rotate, and it doesn't really get it too loose, although again, if you're very aggressive, it still can get loose on you. Wedge is at 51%, and that is to give some feel to the car and also to help it from getting too loose under rotation, particularly on entry of the corner and exit when you're really, you got some steering input into it. Moving on to spring settings, 1,200 pounds on the left front, 1,000 pounds on the right front, also in the rear, 350 and 500 there. I started out with much softer springs, particularly in the front, as I thought that would help me with rotation through the corner, but it turns out it was just the opposite. What this track needs, because you're so aggressive on and off the throttle and running such high speeds all the way around, then I needed the stiffer springs to really help me get a grip and keep the car from rolling over as much. Now, one of the things that, if you're not familiar with that term, when you're on an oval, you go into the corner, the car wants to keep going straight, so the weight wants to shift over to the right-hand side. And if you have soft springs, that can be a very weird feeling, and it can also help you to lose traction very quickly and can be very disconcerting to feel. The stiffer you run the springs and or sway bar, that can really help out with that. So in this case, I found that the combination of the stiffer springs in the front really helped to keep the truck from rolling over any more than it needed to. Now the rear springs were set to 350 and 500 because that helps to keep the car turning through the center, but also keeps the car from getting too loose on exit. Because if I get too loose, then I lose speed, and that defeats the purpose. Tire settings I messed with them a little bit. In fact, I think mostly what I needed to do was increase the right side pressure, but I can't remember exactly. But again, play around with these based off of how you see the inflation going, the tire temperatures going through the corners. Use the B button twice when you're on the track to see the tire temperatures and pressures while you're running in real time. And then you can adjust. I generally try to keep the middle temperature of the tire in between the inside and outside as a general rule. But if you want to help the car turn, then you'll want to increase the difference in tire pressure between the left side and the right side. For instance, on the front end of this car, we're running 27 pounds left side, 31 pounds on the right side. That's 4 pounds of difference. If I increase that to 6, 8, 10, and so on, then that should help the car to rotate. So feel free to play around with that and see what kind of results you get. Moving over to the miscellaneous settings, we are maxed out on front camber, 10 degrees and negative 10 degrees respectively, because that helps with the grip. It helps the car to rotate, and you get the best of both worlds, and there are no negative effects in this game from tire wear, so you really don't have to worry about that at all. Front sway bar is at 1.15. That was about as low as I could get it without disrupting the entry. The lower you put the front sway bar, the more it helps the car to rotate. But in this case, if I went any lower, the car started to get really uneasy going into the corner and sometimes just flat out want to spin out. Rear sway bar as normal. I didn't use the rear sway bar, but again, that's not to discourage you and say that it's not worth using. If you need help with the car rotating, then by all means try out the rear sway bar. Left and right side track bars are 9 inches and 10 inches respectively, and that was not quite as high as I expected to be using. And the reason is the lower front sway bar really helped the car to rotate, and I didn't need as much track bar to help it do so. Only a 1-inch split there between the left side and right side. And again, that's just to help it a little bit from the middle of the corner off with turning. But if the car gets too loose from the center of the corner off, the first thing I would probably do is reduce the right side track bar. The brake bias is a little bit lower than I normally run at 65%. Normally I keep it between 70 and about 75%. The reason it's a little bit lower here is when I'm running against the AI, I need to really use the brakes going into the corner to make sure, because they're going to pinch me down really hard. So I need to make sure that I can keep it down in the corners without getting too tight and pushing up the track. So that's why I run it a little bit lower. Grill tape, basically I ignore it. I'm not even sure I changed that from the default. So I don't spend any time with that because it doesn't do what it should do based on real life. So I generally ignore it. Wheel lock is at 10 degrees and steering offset is at 0.10, both of which are fairly normal for me. The steering offset in particular, I like the truck to pull a little bit to the left, not a ton, but a little bit to the left. That's why I don't run this any higher than I do. But if you want to offset more of the pull to the left, then simply increase the steering offset number. But again, as I mentioned in all my videos, be careful about how high you get the steering offset. The more you increase this, the more that it straightens up the truck on the straightaway. But if you get it too high, it can start to pull to the right, which is very disconcerting for me, which is why I leave a little bit of pull to the left in it. Now, the gear settings, as normal, I didn't mess with first through fourth. The rear end ratio is what I concentrated on, and it's at 4.11, which basically maxes out the RPMs at the end of the straightaway. The reason I did that is because I wanted to make sure I had the best RPM range for mid-corner to get back on the throttle, because essentially where you're going to make your passes at a short track is from the center of the corner off. Okay, if you can get back to the gas hard and early in the center of the corner, then with a better gear turning more RPMs, you're simply going to get a better launch, and you can beat them down the straightaway and then finish off the pass when you're going into the next corner. So that's the setup that I use for both the trucks and the Xfinity cars here at Iowa. Stay tuned now for some gameplay footage of a short, I believe it's 14 laps, 12 or 14 laps against the AI on maximum difficulty. Thank you very much for joining me, and stay tuned for more NASCAR Heat 2.
Stay low. Steady.